The thunder rolled over Rome like the voice of an angry god, and though marble columns stood unmoving against the storm, the hearts of men quivered. Inside the palace, torchlight shook in the grip of senators who had once commanded legions but now found themselves reduced to trembling hands. The air was heavy with a sound too terrible to be mistaken for music, debate, or triumph. It was the sound of youth being broken, a scream muffled by stone yet still sharp enough to scar. Behind the door of the emperor's private chamber, the empire revealed its darkest face, not as conqueror of nations but as destroyer of its own children. Fathers who once bore Rome's honor now held torches to illuminate their daughters' undoing. And so, in silence and complicity, the empire consumed itself. But to understand how Rome reached this abyss, one must step back to a time of desperate hope. March of 37 CE, the death of Emperor Tiberius spread through the marble corridors like a sudden gust of air. Rome exhaled after decades of suffocation. For 23 years, Tiberius had ruled with suspicion as his crown. He trusted no man, listened to whispers more than reason, and sent countless citizens to execution under charges of treason that could be conjured by the faintest rumor. Senators who had once spoken boldly in the forum now measured each word like prisoners choosing their last meal. Citizens moved as if under a shadow, knowing that even laughter in a tavern could be twisted into disloyalty. Rome was an empire on edge, where silence was survival and joy itself had become a dangerous luxury. So when word came that Tiberius was dead, the city erupted as if winter had finally broken. Senators allowed themselves to smile in public. Citizens filled the streets, sacrifices burned in temples, and the Praetorian Guard looked eagerly for a new star to follow. That star appeared not in the form of a grim veteran of politics but in a young man whose very name carried the weight of promise: Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Rome knew him by another name, one that carried affection rather than fear: Caligula, Little Boots. As a child he had trailed after his father, the beloved General Germanicus, through muddy encampments, wearing a miniature soldier's uniform. Soldiers had adored the boy who walked among them, his tiny boots kicking up dust where legions marched. To them, he was not merely a child of privilege but one of their own, born in the scent of leather and iron, a prince of camps rather than cloisters. Now, that child of the legions was emperor. To the Romans, he was more than a ruler by bloodline. He was the living heir of Augustus himself, the grandson of hope, the boy they believed had grown into a man of destiny. His ascension was greeted as rebirth. The forum, long dulled by fear, resounded with cheers. People embraced in marketplaces, declaring that dignity might finally return to Rome. Priests lifted their arms to the gods in thanksgiving. Even hardened senators, weary of Tiberius's reign of suspicion, wept openly when Caligula entered the Senate chamber for the first time, his youthful face glowing like the dawn after a long night. In his early months, Caligula seemed to embody every dream Rome had whispered during Tiberius's long, suffocating rule. He was generous, charming, and above all, human. He issued bonuses to soldiers, strengthening the loyalty of the legions. He cut taxes that had weighed upon the poor, easing the burdens of families who had endured years of suspicion and financial strain. And he staged grand gladiatorial games, filling the Colosseum with the roar of spectacle. Rome's citizens, long denied joy, feasted on the blood-soaked theater as if it were proof that life itself had returned. The Senate, too, felt a cautious rebirth of pride. Caligula's speeches charmed them, his gestures carried a warmth that Tiberius had never shown. In their marble halls, senators whispered that perhaps, at last, Rome had found a ruler who blended the charisma of Julius Caesar with the benevolence of Augustus. Some even wrote prayers of thanksgiving, as though the gods themselves had finally granted mercy to the empire. It was a time when Rome seemed to remember how to laugh again. Merchants hawked goods in the markets with renewed vigor. Families hosted feasts, children playing in courtyards without fear of soldiers arriving with writs of accusation. Priests performed sacrifices of gratitude, their altars burning with offerings of oxen and wine. The Praetorian Guard, ever the weather vane of imperial fortune, rallied behind Caligula with a devotion that bordered on worship. And yet, even in this dawn of promise, faint cracks whispered beneath the surface. Small, almost invisible signs, like the hairline fracture in a statue that only deepens with time. A serving girl vanished from the palace kitchens, explained away as a runaway, yet whispers hinted at something far darker. A body surfaced downstream, mutilated in ways that hardened guards refused to describe. Another boy disappeared, another girl was whispered about, their corpses later appearing in the Tiber, faces twisted in agony. The palace offered silence, and the emperor smiled in public as though nothing had happened. Rome, desperate for hope, chose denial. Citizens excused the rumors, dismissing them as the indulgences of a young man who would surely grow into responsibility. Senators assured themselves that time would temper his appetites. After all, had he not restored joy to the city? Was he not still young? Did not every emperor deserve indulgence? These were the whispers passed in marble corridors, each word an attempt to suppress the unease already pulsing beneath Rome's skin. The empire had waited too long for someone who smiled, who laughed, who appeared human. Rome wanted to believe in Caligula, needed to believe in him. And so, even as shadows gathered at the edge of his reign, the people looked away. They feasted, they prayed, they whispered assurances to one another that all would be well. Yet history teaches us that the first cracks, if ignored, become fractures. And fractures, left untended, split marble into ruin. The marble mask of youthful promise still glowed in public, but behind it, threads of a darker design were already weaving themselves into the fabric of Rome's future. The thunder had not yet broken, but the storm was already gathering. The honeymoon of Caligula's reign could not last. Like a bright flame that dazzles the eyes before the smoke begins to sting, his first months of joy masked something darker. Rome had been eager to believe in him, but already, whispers clung to the marble walls like shadows after dusk. The first signs came in silence, in things that were missing. A kitchen servant vanished without explanation. The steward claimed she had run away, terrified of punishment. But rumors spread faster than officials could silence them. A body floating in the Tiber, mutilated so grotesquely that soldiers who discovered it refused to give details. Then, more disappearances. A boy of 15, a girl of 17. Their corpses, when they too surfaced, bore faces frozen in torment. The palace said nothing. The emperor continued to smile in public, presiding over games, speaking in the Senate, walking among the people. And Rome, still drunk on relief after Tiberius, chose to look away. How could they confront the possibility that their savior was already corrupt? How could they admit that the joy they had rediscovered might have been a mask all along? The senators whispered excuses to themselves. Was he not young? Was it not natural for a man of power to test boundaries? Surely, indulgence would fade with maturity. Surely, he would learn restraint. These were lies they told each other, not out of conviction, but out of fear. For to question too loudly was to risk being noticed. And to be noticed by Caligula was already becoming dangerous. But then came October of 37 CE, 6 months into his reign, and the city was shaken by something no one could dismiss, an illness that struck Caligula like the hand of the gods. It began suddenly, a fever, a delirium that left him writhing between life and death. Word spread through Rome like wildfire. Their young emperor, their beacon of hope, was at the brink of the grave. Panic rippled through the streets. Temples overflowed with citizens, priests slaughtered oxen on altars, pouring wine until the stones were soaked. Mothers clutched their children, begging the gods to spare the ruler who had given them laughter again. Even the soldiers, hardened men who mocked omens and sneered at prayers, whispered desperate appeals to Mars and Jupiter. Senators who had long practiced stoicism broke down in tears, terrified of losing the boy who had restored their pride. It was as if the entire empire held its breath, suspended between despair and hope. And then, miracle! Weeks later, Caligula rose from his bed, pale but alive. The news ignited Rome into frenzy. Celebrations erupted in every district. Families feasted in his honor, sacrifices filled the temples, animals slaughtered as thanksgiving to the gods who had spared him. The Senate proclaimed his survival divine intervention, and the people hailed him as chosen by the heavens themselves. But those who stood closest to him whispered of something far stranger. The man who emerged from his sickbed was not the same as the man who had collapsed into it. Something in the fever had burned him, seared away the last fragile barrier of his humanity. He did not see survival as a gift but as proof of his own immortality. From that day, Caligula no longer regarded himself as mortal flesh bound by law and morality. He believed he had crossed into divinity. He had touched death and returned, and in his mind, that meant he was now a god walking among men. At first, the transformation revealed itself quietly, cloaked in the glamour of palace banquets. Senators' wives received private invitations to dine with the emperor, invitations they dared not refuse. Husbands said nothing, knowing silence was survival. Noble boys were honored with palace service, their youth painted and perfumed, their bodies made into ornaments of humiliation. Rome still tried to look away. Citizens murmured that he was merely indulging in youthful appetites. Senators told themselves that indulgence would fade. But indulgence did not fade. It hardened. It transformed into ritual. And Rome, in its silence, allowed it. The small cracks in the marble mask were widening. And soon, they would split wide open. Caligula's illness had done more than bring him close to death. It had convinced him that he had crossed a boundary no other mortal had ever crossed. To the people, he had been spared by the gods. To Caligula himself, he was now one of them. The fever that nearly consumed his body left behind a soul that believed itself untouchable. When he reappeared before the people, he walked not with the tentative steps of a man recovering from the brink, but with the arrogance of one who believed that the grave had rejected him. His face, thinner and more pallid than before, seemed to radiate a strange glow. Rome rejoiced, but his gaze was different now, sharper, colder, detached. In his eyes burned the certainty that he was no longer bound by human law, custom, or morality. He had survived death itself, and that survival was proof, at least to him, of divinity. At first, the Senate tried to embrace this new confidence. They called his recovery a miracle, voted honors in his name, and paraded his survival as a divine blessing for Rome. But beneath their robes of celebration lay unease. Something in his speech, in his gestures, in the way he looked at them had changed. He no longer addressed them as colleagues or even as subordinates. He spoke to them as if they were worshippers. The earliest signs of this shift were hidden behind velvet curtains and golden doors. Banquets became the stage upon which Caligula rehearsed his new-found godhood. At these feasts, senators' wives were summoned to sit near him, their faces pale beneath forced smiles. Husbands dared not object, for an invitation from the emperor was not a request, it was a command. To refuse was treason. To question was suicide. Young noble boys were summoned under the guise of honor, told they would serve at the palace. But service meant something altogether different. Their cheeks were rouged, their hair perfumed, their garments chosen to mock the dignity of their families. They became decorations in Caligula's private theater of humiliation. Rome, still intoxicated by gratitude that he had lived, chose to ignore the whispers. Senators looked away, convincing themselves that such indulgence was temporary, that youth would mellow into discipline. Citizens excused him, telling themselves that the emperor was still young, still finding the balance of power and responsibility. The Praetorian Guard, who had tied their loyalty to his survival, remained silent, binding themselves to his madness without yet realizing it. But indulgence did not fade, it calcified into ritual. What had once been the hidden excesses of a ruler became deliberate exercises in domination. Caligula began to surround himself not with men of honor, but with those who shared his appetite for cruelty. Loyalty was no longer measured by military oath, but by willingness to participate in depravity. It was in this atmosphere that Helicon, a freedman of cunning instinct, rose to prominence as arbiter voluptatum, the master of pleasures. He understood that survival meant anticipating the emperor's darkest desires, procuring whatever bodies, however obscene the demand, and ensuring that no appetite went unsatisfied. Behind the facade of palace banquets, a machinery of cruelty began to take shape. At first, it was invisible to the public eye, hidden in chambers and whispered through corridors. But whispers in Rome, like smoke from a fire, could not be contained for long. The faint cracks in Caligula's mask had now deepened into visible fractures. His illness had not humbled him, it had unchained him. Rome was ruled not by a man, but by one who believed himself immortal. And immortality, in his hands, meant that nothing, no law, no tradition, no family bond, was sacred. The city still celebrated, still clung to hope, still convinced itself that this was indulgence, not transformation. But the truth was already visible to those who dared to look. The young emperor who had once seemed the dawn of a new Rome was slipping into something else entirely. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it had begun. By the summer of 38 CE, the storm that Rome had refused to see was no longer hidden. Caligula's appetites were not fading with maturity, they were crystallizing into a system, a ritual of domination given form and permanence. What began as private indulgence turned into an institution of cruelty, bound together not by passion but by the cold precision of administration. The first sign of this transformation appeared in the archives. In a city where ledgers and scrolls had long recorded the lifeblood of empire, grain shipments, tax revenues, troop numbers, there emerged a new kind of record. It did not track commerce or conquest, but people. Women, children, sons of merchants, daughters of senators, each name stripped down into an entry, reduced to an item, a unit of flesh catalogued with the same detachment Rome once reserved for barrels of wheat. These scrolls, written in the neat script of imperial scribes, revealed something chilling. Cruelty had become paperwork. At the heart of this system was Helicon, the freedman whom Caligula had elevated to serve as the engineer of his pleasures. Where others might hesitate, Helicon understood instantly that survival meant complicity. He procured whatever the emperor demanded, no matter how obscene, and documented it with bureaucratic efficiency. Each victim was catalogued with details of age, appearance, and usefulness. The language was clinical, as though describing livestock. Some entries survive in fragments, their words stripped of humanity: female, senatorial class, restricted assignment. Behind that detached phrase was a life shattered, a family broken, a society forced into silence. The ledgers became weapons as much as records. Senators who had once walked proudly in the forum now moved through the palace with hollow eyes, knowing that to oppose the emperor in debate could mean seeing a daughter's name entered into the book within days. A question in the Senate could condemn a wife to imperial service. To remain silent was no protection either, only a delay of the inevitable. Caligula's hunger was not for strangers but for the very families who should have been untouchable. He aimed his cruelty where it would wound most deeply, at the bonds of kinship that had anchored Rome for centuries. Soon, the cruelty demanded witnesses. Fathers were summoned to the palace, handed torches, and ordered to illuminate the horrors inflicted on their own children. It was not enough for Caligula to break bodies, he broke souls by forcing protectors into accomplices. The torchbearer's duty became a ritual of humiliation, one in which silence was enforced by terror, and survival meant complicity in a daughter's destruction. The architecture of the palace itself began to bend to these rituals. Architects were instructed not to build for beauty, but for acoustics. Walls were designed to carry screams clearly into waiting chambers so that those next in line would hear the fate that awaited them. Torch brackets were mounted at precise heights, ensuring fathers could not avoid the sight of what was happening before them. Even the physical space of the empire was reshaped to serve cruelty. And Rome whispered. In taverns, citizens spoke of disappearances, of noblewomen who entered the palace and never returned, of young boys who emerged painted and broken, their childhood stolen. But no one spoke too loudly. Everyone understood the danger of being heard. Even a rumor repeated too openly could mean inclusion in the ledgers. And once written, a name was as good as condemned. This was the genius of Caligula's system, not simply that he committed atrocities, but that he institutionalized them. He transformed evil into administration, cruelty into policy. He no longer needed to command through swords or open executions. Fear itself had become a bureaucracy. By forcing Rome's most powerful men to bear witness with torches in their hands, he turned them into prisoners of their own silence. The empire that had once prided itself on law and order now rotted from within, its noblest families reduced to bargaining chips, its senators silenced into trembling torchbearers. The ledgers swelled, the torches burned, and the soul of Rome began to crumble. The cracks had become fractures, and the fractures were splitting into collapse. What had begun as whispers in the marble corridors was now undeniable. By the end of 38 CE, cruelty was no longer a hidden indulgence, it was codified procedure. Rome, the empire that had once prided itself on order and law, had allowed its palace to become a factory of horror. The shift was subtle in its beginnings, but unmistakable in its completion. Caligula had transformed depravity into an institution. The palace no longer echoed with the bustle of servants or the solemn rituals of governance. Instead, it was redesigned as a theater of humiliation. The architects, once tasked with building monuments to Rome's glory, were now ordered to craft chambers of terror. Every detail was calculated, walls thick enough to carry screams with piercing clarity, so that waiting victims could not ignore what awaited them, torches mounted at precise intervals, fixed into bronze sconces so witnesses could see every detail, unable to turn away. Light itself had become a weapon, wielded not for guidance but for exposure. The ritual of the torchbearer epitomized this new Rome. Fathers, senators, magistrates, men whose ancestors had marched in triumphs and dictated laws, were summoned with their daughters. At dawn, sealed orders arrived, written in the cold, detached language of bureaucracy. They were to appear at the palace, accompanied by their eldest unmarried child. Upon arrival, the men were handed torches, instructed where to stand, how high to hold the flame, how long to remain motionless. Guards drilled them with military precision, warning that even the tremor of an arm or the flicker of a protest would bring harsher punishment, often the addition of another daughter's name to the ledger. To hold the torch was not merely to illuminate a chamber. It was to be forced into complicity, to watch with frozen silence as one's own family was destroyed, unable even to look away. It was humiliation elevated to policy, cruelty weaponized not only against the body but against the spirit of Rome itself. The emperor understood that the destruction of flesh was fleeting, but the destruction of dignity, the breaking of protectors into accomplices, poisoned the very core of society. The corridors where these rituals occurred were long, tomb-like halls of marble, 50 feet lined with sconces, each burning flame casting shadows of fathers who had been reduced to statues of despair. The soundscape was engineered, muffled cries through oak doors, the thud of guards' boots, the cruel laughter of an emperor whose madness demanded witnesses. Senators who had once spoken boldly in the forum now recited verses under their breath, or solved mathematical problems in their minds, desperate to detach themselves from the reality their eyes could not escape. And Rome left behind proof of its torment. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered fragments of graffiti etched into the walls of those corridors, carved by trembling hands. "We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk." Another message read, "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." These words, scratched in secret, were not rebellion. They were desperation, testimonies from men who needed the world to know they had been forced, that their silence had not been chosen. The psychological devastation was total. Daughters who emerged from those chambers could not meet their fathers' eyes, not out of blame, but because the memory itself was unbearable. Families fractured. Bonds that had endured generations dissolved into silence. Mothers clutched their younger children, terrified that summons would come again. Sons looked at their fathers with suspicion, knowing the man who once protected the household had stood, torch in hand, as its shield was shattered. This was Caligula's true genius in terror. He corrupted not only the public sphere of Senate and state, but the private sanctum of the Roman home. He twisted love itself into a weapon. In every household, fear lingered, not only of the emperor, but of one another, for survival demanded compliance, and compliance left scars that outlived the empire itself. Some senators drowned their shame in wine, drinking themselves into oblivion. Others fell upon their swords, unable to bear the weight of their complicity. But most endured, walking Rome's streets like hollow men, alive in body but dead in spirit. And when they passed each other in the forum, they exchanged glances heavy with unspoken knowledge. "We have all been broken, we are all captives now." The empire of conquest, the Rome that once marched across continents, had turned inward. It no longer expanded outward in glory. It consumed itself in silence and fear. The torchbearer's flames lit not only the rooms of the palace, but the collapse of Rome's soul. If there was one final boundary Rome believed untouchable, it was the sanctity of family. Conquerors might pillage cities, emperors might indulge in cruelty, but the bonds of blood were sacred. In Rome, the household was more than private life. It was the foundation of law, order, and civilization itself. Caligula understood this. And so, in his madness, he aimed his cruelty at the very heart of Rome, his own blood. The whispers had begun early. During the fever that nearly killed him in 37 CE, only one was permitted to remain at his side, his sister, Drusilla. Physicians were dismissed, priests excluded. She alone was allowed into his chamber, tending to him in his delirium. When he recovered, he declared before the Senate and the gods that Drusilla was more than a sister, she was his divine counterpart. Her husband was exiled to a distant governorship, a polite disguise for disgrace, and Drusilla was moved into the emperor's quarters, treated as though she were wife, consort, and priestess all at once. At first, Rome dismissed the rumors. Brothers and sisters were close, perhaps too close, yes, but the city chose to ignore what it could not confront. Yet Caligula himself stripped away the veil of secrecy. In one of the most infamous spectacles in Roman history, he unveiled his obsession before 300 witnesses, senators, priests, foreign ambassadors. The banquet hall shimmered with golden lamps, musicians strummed their lyres to mask the unease in the room, and platters of delicacies were carried on silver trays. But the atmosphere collapsed into suffocating silence when Caligula, reclining at the head of the table, reached for Drusilla's hand and drew her onto his lap. Murmurs rippled, cups froze mid-air, and the marble seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice calm and deliberate, he declared before the assembly, "My divine sisters, blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection as Juno shares his." The invocation was no accident. By invoking the marriage of Jupiter and Juno, Rome's king and queen of gods, he cloaked incest in the guise of myth, turning sacrilege into ritual. The senators faced an impossible choice: applaud sacrilege or risk being accused of treason. And so they applauded, their hollow clapping echoing through marble halls while their eyes betrayed horror. Drusilla was forced into the role of consort, presiding beside him at audiences, standing with him during religious ceremonies, seated at his side in processions. Rome's customs were mocked with every appearance. And at night, she was subjected to humiliations that mocked the very foundation of Roman values. Her sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, fared no better. Julia's fiery defiance brought punishment so severe it silenced her spirit. Agrippina, cleverer and colder, concealed her rage, storing each humiliation in memory as currency for vengeance yet to come. But for the moment, resistance was futile. Rome itself had become Caligula's stage, and his sisters, daughters of Germanicus, heirs of Augustus, were forced into roles as unwilling actresses in his theater of desecration. Then came the climax of his mania, Drusilla's pregnancy. Caligula stood before the Senate, clad in purple and gold, and proclaimed that the child in her womb was no ordinary life but the heir of a god, destined to rule both heaven and earth. Senators who once shaped the fate of nations bowed their heads and voted honors for an unborn child conceived in incest. Priests offered sacrifices in temples. Citizens were ordered to pray for the health of the infant. Rome, once the defender of law, now celebrated the destruction of its own moral foundation as divine spectacle. But fate intervened. In June of 38 CE, Drusilla died suddenly. Some whispered it was complications in childbirth, others murmured poison, delivered by hands too weary to endure more humiliation. The truth, like so much in Caligula's Rome, was buried with her. His grief did not soften him. It shattered what little restraint remained. He declared Drusilla a goddess, erected temples in her honor, demanded oaths to be sworn by her divinity, and commanded Rome to worship the woman he had destroyed. Priests performed rites in her name, senators raised altars, citizens bowed their heads before a goddess created not by the heavens but by the emperor's desecration. For Julia and Agrippina, Drusilla's death did not end their torment, it magnified it. They were compelled to impersonate her, to wear her garments, to speak her words, to play roles in ceremonies that turned grief into grotesque parody. To resist meant death. To comply meant surrendering to degradation so profound it hollowed the soul. Witnesses later testified that during palace rituals, Caligula pointed to his sisters and declared, "If I can do this to my own blood, imagine what awaits your daughters." The message was clear: no law, no tradition, no relationship, not even the sanctity of Roman family life, could shield anyone from his will. With this, the last sacred boundary was broken. And Rome, compelled to applaud, betrayed itself more deeply than in any battle lost to foreign enemies. If Caligula's incestuous desecrations shattered Rome's moral foundation, what followed revealed the full scope of his madness. He turned private depravity into public institution. Cruelty was no longer a passing indulgence. It became a system, dressed in the garments of religion, sustained by bureaucracy, and weaponized against the very men who should have opposed him. In the east wing of the imperial palace, beneath ceilings painted with serene goddesses, Caligula established what inscriptions later called the Temple of Divine Service. To the casual visitor, it appeared a sanctuary of piety. Altars smoked with incense, hymns echoed through gilded corridors, attendants moved in solemn rhythm. But behind that veneer of sanctity, the temple functioned as a processing house of humiliation. Women of Rome's noblest families were summoned not as worshippers but as offerings, their dignity disguised as ritual, their degradation masked by the fragrance of frankincense. Each act was documented. Scribes sat in alcoves, quills scratching across parchment with the same detachment used to record tax receipts. Names were reduced to categories: senatorial class, high value, merchant's daughter, restricted service, male youth, decorative assignment. Every entry was preserved in duplicate, stored in the imperial archives, a permanent record of corruption that implicated Rome's elite as complicit participants. For Caligula's genius lay not only in cruelty but in implicating everyone around him. Senators seeking imperial favor were issued ivory tokens inscribed with chamber numbers and times. These tokens were not invitations but obligations. To attend meant standing silent while one's wife or daughter was paraded as an offering. To refuse meant destruction. Worse still, each senator's presence was recorded in the ledgers. Later, should anyone raise a voice of opposition, Caligula needed only to produce the documents that proved their compliance. Their silence was not just survival, it was insurance for the emperor's tyranny. But this machinery of humiliation was not enough. Caligula's mind turned toward the future supply of victims. Thus began one of the most grotesque perversions of Roman administration, the breeding program. Physicians, trained in Alexandria and once sworn to heal, were now ordered to evaluate women like livestock. Hips measured, fertility histories catalogued, bloodlines cross-matched for desired outcomes. Pairings were assigned not by choice but by calculation, unions forced under the watchful eyes of guards and scribes. Pregnancies were monitored with obsessive precision. Diets prescribed, movements restricted, miscarriages punished as sabotage. Births were recorded not as miracles but as inventory. Newborns were seized from mothers, categorized according to imperial classification. Boys with strong frames were destined for military training. Delicate-featured boys were prepared for palace service. Girls of beauty were marked for future temple work. Those deemed less useful were relegated to menial labor. Families were erased, replaced with categories. Bloodlines, once Rome's pride, were dissected into functions. Perhaps the most grotesque perversion of all was inflicted upon noble boys, the heirs of Rome's proudest houses. They were not trained as soldiers but as courtesans. Within the north wing of the palace, mirror-lined chambers forced them to watch their own transformation. Attendants bathed them in scented oils, plucked away the signs of boyhood, draped them in silks, braided flowers into their hair. Their voices were trained to rise into falsetto until they cracked with strain. Their names, Marcus, Lucius, Gaius, were erased and replaced with Flora, Lily, Rose. They were no longer sons of Rome but floral mockeries, categorized in ledgers as male attendants, assessed for beauty, grace, and obedience. Fragments of these records, preserved across centuries, reveal the chilling efficiency of this system. Marginal notes read like the calculations of a merchant: increase inventory before festival season. Younger categories generate higher revenue. Compliance improves with narcotics. Cold, pragmatic suggestions, as if human agony were an industry to be optimized. By the end of 39 CE, the palace no longer resembled the seat of empire. It was an institution of exploitation, divided into departments with the precision of military logistics: procurement, processing, classification, breeding, training. Guards ensured acquisition. Physicians ensured functionality. Scribes ensured documentation. Senators ensured silence. Rome still dined, traded, prayed in temples. But the true empire, the one rotting at its core, was being written in ledgers that turned flesh into figures, children into inventory, suffering into statistics. This was Caligula's innovation: to turn cruelty into a bureaucracy so cold, so efficient, that evil itself could be preserved, scaled, and endured. Of all Caligula's perversions, none encapsulated Rome's collapse more vividly than the ritual of the torchbearer. To be summoned to the palace with one's daughter, to be handed a flame, and to be ordered to stand immobile while the emperor desecrated what was most sacred. This was terror elevated into policy. Fathers who had once stood as shields of their households were transformed into unwilling accomplices, their silence purchased not by loyalty but by fear of annihilation. A single refusal could bring extermination: brothers executed, wives enslaved, families scattered like ashes on the wind. The corridor where these men waited was no mere hallway but a tomb for the living. 50 feet of polished marble, sconces aligned with mathematical precision, each torch placed so that its light fell directly upon the chamber door. The architecture itself was complicit, ensuring no witness could claim blindness. Guards patrolled the line, barking reminders to hold the torch steady, warning that even a flicker of resistance would be punished with further entries in the ledger. And so, men who once dictated the laws of nations now stood trembling, their arms aching under the weight of a flame that burned brighter than the honor they had already lost. Archaeology has preserved fragments of their despair. In scratched graffiti along the marble, trembling hands left messages that outlasted the empire: "We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk." Another plea, etched in desperation: "May the gods forgive what emperors compel." These words were not rebellion, they were confession, the proof that Rome's silence was not voluntary but forced. The men who had been Rome's voices left behind only whispers carved into stone. The devastation stretched far beyond the palace walls. Families fractured under the weight of unspeakable memory. Daughters returned from those chambers unable to look their fathers in the eye. Not out of blame, but because the silence was unbearable. Mothers clutched their younger children in fear, praying the next summons would not bear their names. Sons regarded their fathers with suspicion, for how could the man who once symbolized protection also stand as a torchbearer to destruction? This was Caligula's true mastery. He weaponized love itself. By forcing the most sacred bond, between parent and child, into an instrument of terror, he poisoned every Roman household. Trust dissolved. The family, once the cornerstone of Roman law and tradition, became a site of unspoken shame. And in that silence, the empire rotted. Even his assassination in January of 41 CE could not erase what had been done. The Praetorian Guard cut him down behind the curtains of a theater, blades flashing like divine justice long delayed. His blood spilled, his body was hacked apart, his reign ended. But the systems he had created, the ledgers, the torch sconces, the architecture of humiliation, did not vanish with his death. They endured as scars etched into marble and memory. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered these remnants. Torch holders still fixed into palace walls at precise intervals, confirming ancient accounts. Fragments of ledgers, where the daughter of a senator was reduced to item 247. Scratched notes from boys who had been feminized into courtesans, testaments of despair that no fire could erase. These ruins did not sing of glory. They whispered of shame. And the trauma lingered. Generations carried invisible scars. Daughters flinched at thunder, remembering the nights when storms echoed the cries of the palace. Sons grew into men who could not lead, because their fathers had been broken into torchbearers. Families whispered of dishonor, but never aloud, for even memory had become too heavy to bear. This was the empire's true wound. Not political instability, not the assassination of one emperor, but the slow, silent corruption of its very soul. Rome had betrayed itself, not on the battlefield against foreign enemies, but in its own marble corridors, when the guardians of dignity bowed before madness. And so, when we speak today of the most horrific practices of Caligula, we are not reciting lurid anecdotes of decadence. We are staring into the abyss of what happens when power strips away humanity, when procedure disguises evil, when silence becomes survival. The ruins of his palace still stand. The sconces remain fixed in marble. The imagination still hears the echoes of screams carried on storm-filled nights. History does not fade, it warns. When cruelty adopts the mask of procedure, when bureaucracy disguises atrocity, when love itself is weaponized, what collapses is not merely an empire but humanity itself. And that is Caligula's true legacy, a shadow that outlived his flesh, a wound carved into the conscience of civilization. History warns us, if you don't want to miss the next lesson from the shadows, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe now. The past has more to tell.